Welcome everybody to this year's annual lecture of the Center for Law and Society in a Global Context. I got that right. It's too long as an acronym. We'll work on that. Which is a center at the Law Department of Queen Mary that focuses on socio-legal work, law and society in a global context, but more and more the last years also thinking in the direction of law and political economy in a global context, and in that context, in that light, Tanzil Chowdhury, who's sitting there, one of the directors, and Eva Nanopoulos have launched the Law and Marxism series a few years ago, in which context this keynote lecture also figures. I'm very happy to introduce to you today Alessandra Mezzadri, reader in Global Development and Political Economy at SOAS University. Alessandra just told me I don't often speak for a legal audience or in a law school, which is something that we have at every annual lecture of our center, so that's very much within the script. Alessandra's work really stands out to me. I've delved into it the last few months in anticipation of this and was really blown away, working at the intersection of international political economy, feminist legal theory, but also really thinking about this from within a development context as well. Her first book, The Sweatshop Regime, was very well received and lauded, a book about India's garments industry. There's many things I can say, but I think people don't want to listen to me too much. I just want to give the beautiful and evocative talk of today's lecture, The Reproductive Laws of Capitalism in the Planetary Social Factory. Every single word of that is like firework in my head, so without further ado, please, Alessandra.
Thank you. When one thinks about titles, that one just think with great ambition, and then you have to eventually live up to that ambition. That becomes tricky. And to an audience of legal scholars, so I would say that within the social sciences, we tend to think of ourselves as party crushers whenever we have to speak of the law. And it's true that I was told when I was invited to deliver this talk that, it's just I would be part of a very long tradition of party crushers, so I can just talk about my things. But I actually do think that there is something, there was something there for me to also look at some of the things that I generally address, mainly in relation to political economy and to feminist political economy in particular, through a lens of the law, what I could really say about some of the implications of what I want to discuss with you today for law and legal processes. So we'll see how that goes. But the weight of the law is constant in different phases of the capitalist project, and the law has been widely discussed as being subservient to capital in different ways. Katharina Pistor, in a great book, defined it as the code of capital, looking at the ways in which legal entitlements and property rights are attributed and generally come to legitimize what the process of political economy actually already allocate. So in a sense, I would be inspired by this very broad engagement with the law as a code of capital and trying to sort of play a little bit with what it means when we look at life and life-making, which is instead the subject of this talk. So when we say that the law is subservient to capital, it's its code, we can think of it in political economy in very different ways, some of which Pistor have actually engaged with and some not. So indeed the law is able to regenerate and crystallize wealth and inequalities. If we look at the work of Thomas Piketty, who's definitely not a lawyer, on taxation and the way in which looking at the long journey of capitalism across 200 years and looking at well, something as boring as taxation data on wealth, he could actually trace the ways in which we have moved slowly towards what he called rentier capitalism, a process whereby in the current phase, capital is actually able to reward itself at the rate which is higher than the overall economic growth. The law has also legitimized oppression, violent, coercive, destructive oppression for the scope of accumulation across the history of mankind, but definitely across the history of capitalism. We shall not forget that slavery was once upon a time and for a very long time legal, and that so was apartheid, and so is genocide, as we live in genocide times, as we are witnessing to the destruction of Gaza in Israel-Palestine. The law also attributes or takes away property rights. In fact, I believe that Pister has an entire chapter on land titles as the code to land. And in fact, related to the first point, the ability of the law to codify dispossession is something which has been cogent with a number of colonial projects and also within a post-colonial context is indeed we find a lot of instances. This is what Brenna Bander has called the colonial life of property. The fact that there is a colonial way in which some are meant to be proprietors of land and some are not. And when I think about continuities with the post-colonial context, of course, this is obvious in settler colonial states, from Palestine to the United States. Fantastic book written by Keanga Yamata-Taylor, Race for Profit, about the subprime crisis, exactly through a colonial lens of private property rights. And also, of course, in context like former colonial power, then many have engaged in processes of dispossession that are consistent with what Marini, the Latin American independentista, called once upon a time internal colonization. Think about what India is doing in the Northeast, think about what Pakistan is doing in Balochistan, think about what China is doing in Tibet, and so on and so forth, right? Mineral-rich areas. Now, political economy, oh yes, and then of course, the law is also sort of legiferated to establish the specific or defend specific units of capitalist governance, like the households, the family, what it means to be a family, who's entitled to be a family, who's entitled to be specific subjectivities. Again, we had a recent taste of that in the current Supreme Court ruling on who can call themselves a woman. And of course, I take the occasion to share my solidarity to all trans and queer siblings for this horrid ruling. Now, so political economy has engaged with the law in different ways, I would say, because sometimes we treat it as a background to what it is that we do, or some other times as part of the rule of the games, which in themselves are an outcome of political economy, or a crystallization of class forces in ways that are consistent with the Poulantzas sort of take on legal outcomes, or like state outcomes, vision of the state as an expression of class relations. From the point of view of social reproduction, however, which is the one that I'm most interested in, we can clearly see that law has a reproductive function vis-à-vis capitalism, and reproductive functions that I called here the reproductive laws of capitalism. So from the point of view of looking now at political economy through the lens of social reproduction and through the lens of life, we can actually learn a fair amount of which type of rules and regulation and legislative moments have been quite important to cement the specific ways in which social reproduction organizes in the present conjunction. So it is based on this that I want to continue my talk. and present you with first what we mean with the social reproduction reading of political economy. And we mean a lot of things, and I will not try to homogenize them. Rather, instead, I want to suggest that we need to keep them plural, and we learn from different approaches to social reproduction fairly different things about the capitalist beast. So it's a way in which we can explore capitalism from the vantage point of life in a different way. And then I'll just talk about the legal implications of that at the end. So using social reproduction as method is by now accepted as a contribution of feminist political economy. However, we have to acknowledge that this is only true in the relatively recent conjuncture from the 70s onwards, because the term in itself, actually we can find it even in proto-theories of political economy that we connect with the physiocrat. No? The first was François Quesnel, that used the term simply to analyze the social stratification of society, and the term itself was reappropriated by Marx to look at the ways in which inequalities were regenerated were incorporated in the regeneration of the labor process itself. It is, however, with Marxist feminists in the 1970s that we do have the reappropriation of the term as a specifically or explicitly feminist term. And in this instantiation, if I have to choose a definition, I will go with the one proposed by Marxist feminist geographer Cindy Katz that defines it as a concept that speaks of all the activities that regenerate life daily and intergenerationally, as well as capitalist relations. It's a bundle where it already tries to capture not just only life, nor only capitalism, but the entanglements of capitalist life. So it's just a messy term by definition. And what looking at now political economy through this lens of social reproduction aims at doing is moving the emphasis from productivism, so studying capitalism as a system of production first, right? So that we study factories and the wage workers and the industrial proletariat, all the sort of the story that we know, which is a bit of a stagey story, whereby there is a lot of preambles to get there, and then the protagonists are relatively few, to instead a story that starts from society as a whole and processes of life-making, and so that places capitalism as something which, quoting from Silvia Federici, starts instead in the kitchen and in the bedrooms, and then of course then has an iteration in structuring the ways in which we produce, consume and distribute, but of course before any of that you have to produce life first. So in a way, what I find quite compelling about social reproduction feminism is the attempt not only to feminize the questions of political economy, which are usefully summarized by Henry Bernstein as quite simple: who owns what, who does what, who gets what, and what do they do with that. So we feminize these questions, but at the same time, we also look and place a lot of emphasis on the questions that political economy does not pose, okay? So who does not own, who makes whom, who gets whose care, and what do we do with waste, or as put very powerfully recently by François Verge in Decolonial Feminism, who cleans our capitalism, okay? So this is to say that these being the questions, not just the question to feminize, but the missing questions to explore, this is a body of work that by definition cannot be a theory. So there is no social reproduction theory as such, encapsulating all of them, but instead we're looking at the plurality of different approaches, and all these approaches not only are not necessarily in competition, but actually they might shed very different light on different aspects of the capitalist beast. So we can study life, or like central life in the study of political economy through social reproduction this thing really doesn't like my computer to degrees, which are a bit bizarre. Okay, so, yes, here we go. Got lost there. All right. So these approaches are complementary and explain different aspects of capitalism as a social factory, to use an expression by Mario Tronti, later feminized by Federici herself. So in these approaches, we see that they are able to actually study the political economy of life, or the production of life, in a slightly different context, contribute slightly differently to the study of capitalism. And when we think about the role that the laws play, or the legal processes have played in these aspects of the reorganization of life, we can think about different trajectories or different moments. So I'll start with the most recent iteration of social reproduction feminism, which is social reproduction theory. And I would say that altogether, this particular instantiation of social reproduction approaches looks at what I would define as the architecture of the social factory of capitalism. So it looks at the institutions of life-making, including the family, but actually also going well beyond. So in a sense, it is what we can define as a feminist theory of reproductive governance of capitalism that defines capitalism first as a reproductive system before being a productive system. So if you do read essays within, of course, Titi Bhattacharya's famous edited collection, but also if you look at contributions by different SRTers, you will see that there's a lot of emphasis on reproductive sectors, health sectors, clinics. They've done a lot of work with different categories of reproductive workers, junior doctors, teachers, and so on and so forth. So the paid aspect, if you want, of reproduction is very much covered by this framework. And I would say that within that, there is an attempt to remap the history of capitalism, not starting from the different moments of accumulation or the different phases of accumulation, but from the different social reproductive regimes, in the words of Nancy Fraser, that have accompanied various shifts. So we have the reorganization of life first, across different phases of capitalism, and then connected with different modes of accumulation. Now, particularly, the framework has dedicated a lot of emphasis on the rise of neoliberalism as a very specific socially reproductive regime that is characterized by marketized and commodified social reproduction and the financialization of pretty much everything. And I would say that a lot of the focus has been on the global north in relation to the ways in which marketization and financialization have increased massively from the 1970s onwards, but you can find indeed connections with the processes in the global south, although of course you have to not level out or flatten the differences. So in the global north, we've seen the rise of austerity programs in the 70s, and we have seen the withdrawal of welfare states exactly from this period that has hit the organization of social reproduction and the rise of care chains, both domestically and internationally. So the way in which we actually conduct ourselves from neoliberal times is exactly that we purchase the reproductive labor and reproductive services that we need. but at the same time, there is also a huge reorganization that's gone on in different parts of the Global South, because the logic of structural adjustment has been very similar in terms of reprivatizing social reproduction, even in contexts whereby there were not necessarily welfare systems at work. Now, in relation to thinking about the ways in which the law has been central in these processes, is quite fundamental, because we have seen within neoliberalism, especially in the early period, this underlying of how the neoliberal project could be understood ultimately as a process of deregulation or delegalization of a number of realms which instead were strictly regulated before. But as noted by Tickle and Peck, you do observe two different moments within the neoliberal transformation. The first that we can call as rollback neoliberalism, where effectively all this still legal process of destruction of the previous sort of legal apparatus was at work, and then you have a process which is generative of instead new regulations, which even pushing for capital-oriented projects still invoked the law and needed the law to put this forward. This is brought home quite powerfully, for instance, in a book by Brabanson, which is Neoliberal Legality, and has been referred in his chapter, Rob Knox, who I understand was also here delivering this lecture before me, has in fact defined the neoliberal movement as a flurry of juridification, so well far away from the idea of sort of law-free type of environment. My argument is that a lot of this reorganization, legal reorganization, actually supported processes of reprivatization of life in different contexts. So the rise not only of commodified domesticity, but also the rise of a huge number of reproductive markets. It is exactly from the 1980s that we observe. So, and we have increasingly that the type of generations of jobs that we have seen during the neoliberal phase have been in fact reproductive in nature. And also the push towards what political economist Adrian Roberts have called the financialization of life. So the debt-based reorganization of social reproduction is something which, again, we can trace both in the Global North and in the Global South, although, of course, in the Global North, there's a lot of emphasis on housing and mortgages and consumption, while in the Global South, still, we do see from the 80s onwards the rise of public-private partnerships, which are used by the World Bank extensively, and we have realized the extent of which actually they dominate in the areas of health, just with the COVID crisis, where the World Bank COVID Fund was dedicated was channeled half to financial operators that are operating in health. There's a fantastic work by Urania Dimaku, together with Elisa Weinberger and who's the third? Tobias Franz, on these issues. And instead, in the global, and also in the Global South, what we do see instead is a privatization of utilities. So, on the one hand, the rise of PPPs, and on the other, the privatization of water and electricity. There's a lot of literature from South Africa to India, for instance, is something which, again, speaks of these processes of financialization of life, which have been central to the neoliberal phase. So this is already like one of the social reproduction feminist schools, and how much it can give us in terms of a different outlook of how the political economy of capitalism sort of speaks to us when we center life rather than production. In fact, I would want to suggest that the type of transformations that we witnessed in the last 60 years are far more dramatic if we look at the ways in which we live rather than the way in which we produce only. And I would do now the same with the second lens, which is the lens of early social reproduction analysis, which is particularly dear to me because it's concerned with the world of work, which remains, I would say, in my heart of hearts, as fundamentally union organizer, as what I feel I'm closer to. Now, early social reproduction analysis had a different concern than social reproduction theory, and the concern was to try to specifically show how reproductive activities and realms produce value for capital. Not value in a moral sense, you know, we all value people and you know, it's value to be in a home and nurture your kids. But actually, in a Marxian sense, so they produce for the market, they're connected to the processes of exchange and extraction, which are fundamental to capitalism. Of course, when we think about early social reproduction analysis, we go back to the 1970s. The first essay of seminal relevance, we find it in 1972 with the publication of Maria Rosa Dalla Costa and Selma James, The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community, which is a very, very small book. It's actually more of a political pamphlet. But the argument made was exactly that in order to study capitalism, we shall not start from the productive realm, but we shall start from trying to grapple with who produces the most precious commodity of all in capitalism, that one commodity that upon consumption produces value and without which no value can be created, that is the worker and labor power. Now, starting from their contributions, you have a plethora of other authors which have contributed to the debate and have worked tirelessly to sort of subvert, disrupt, smash open the categories of political economy. Silvia Federici have done so with reference to primitive accumulation, Leopoldina Fortunati with reference to the differences between exchange and use value, Antonella Picchio countering ideas of the wage as an indicator of rewards for productivity in capitalism, and instead showing how it's simply an indicator of inequality in the labor market. Now, I call it early social reproduction analysis, and I don't call it domestic labor debate, which is how you generally get it in the feminist textbooks. Because, as a matter of fact, I think the interventions were far broader than the domestic labor debate in Italy itself. And also many of these women do not consider themselves as part of the domestic labor debate at all, if you ask them. So be careful about boxing. But also because in the same period we have the writing of Maria Mies that was working on the ways in which unpaid labor in the home for women also meant a devaluation of the work outside the home, even if some of these women produce for the world market. So Mies writes this amazing book, 1982, The Lace Maker of Narsapur, and then from that which she will write Patriarchy and Accumulation on the Global Scale. I had the pleasure of going back to Narsapur last year. It was a special experience, I have to say. And in the same period, we also have the writing of Rhoda Reddock that writes about indentured labor and gender in the Caribbean, and again looks at the way in which reproductive activities were central to the way in which labor surplus was pumped from the plantations. And you also have, in the same period, Rohini Hensman writing in India about how to understand domestic servitude, not as something that belongs to the sphere of simple circulation, in English, a personal service, right? But instead had to be considered as productive consumption, something that produces values you consume, again, so within a broader scope of political economy. So you do have all this contribution in this early period that point at the fact that we need to rethink the ways in which we understand exploitation, we understand labor and who's a laborer, and we need to rework the social perimeters of what we define as the planetary labor process. I would say that their insights are still very relevant today, as we see that the world of work itself increasingly works through these entanglements between production and reproduction, whereby the division becomes increasingly difficult to even trace, right? If you look at the last ILO data, 2018, we just have around 61% of the total workforce planetarily that work in informal occupations. 69% if you look at only the global south. Even if you only look at the global north, we're almost hitting 45%. This is also thanks to the rise of platform capitalism and so on, but also to the fact that, formalized wage labor has always constituted a minuscule aspect of the capitalist project, if you look at numbers. So in a sense, wageless life has always been, to quote from Denning, has always been central to the regeneration of capitalism since the beginning. So in this light, when I look at the early social reproduction analysis, unlike social reproduction theory, it gives me something else. While SRT gives us a snapshot of the reproductive architecture of capitalism, right? Its bones, if you want, the skeleton. Instead, early social reproduction analysis give us its DNA, give us the laws of value that are at work within the social factory of capital. Now, of course, the ways in which the law has been implicated in restructuring this particular assembly line have to do with labor laws, but also with trade laws. And in fact, feminist political economy have written beautiful stuff about this as I was digging for this lecture. First, of course, this is an area where I'm more familiar with. There's been a huge amount of re-regulation when it comes to labor laws, right, everywhere. And India, which is a country that I look at mostly, has just now come up again in the last 3 years with the new labor codes, which are being implemented. But you have seen this sort of restructuring of labor legislation that has been a constant within neoliberalism and has been key to the process the guy standing has defined of global flexibilization of labor. So to have assembly laws that guarantee this flexibility, this porosity of the assembly line, and the possibility to valorize realms of social reproduction has been a constant of the neoliberal period. So much so that has created now, for those of us that work in the field, factories which are connected, literally connected with dormitory realms for workers that become one with the factory itself. Chinese sociologist Mies has called this the dormitory labor regime. In China, they have specific infrastructures, and these infrastructures sometimes even manifest in the creation of entire villages that work for the one factory, panopticon, right? If you think of Foxconn and villages like Longhua. But also in India or Vietnam or other places where I'm more familiar with within Asia, you would see that you still have a dormitory aspect to the factory, which might be more informally organized, but is still very central to the ways in which employers, capital, is able to recall people on the assembly line more and more. And it's a type of social reproduction, the one that dominates industrial areas nowadays across large swathes of the global south, which is an individualized type of social reproduction. So it's true that you have across the history of capitalism in many different places the creation of dormitories. You can say, well, it's a good thing, right, that you produce housing. But if you do produce housing that only individual workers can live in, sharing room with other individual workers without the possibility ever for family life, for a liberatory form of social reproduction, for like bringing their spouses, raising their children, having their own relations within these spaces, then of course it's a very different thing that you're looking at altogether. It's not that type of factory life that we are, well, I'm not, but many, I would say, from the left are so sort of nostalgic about. It's a very different type of factory that we have. Donatella Alessandrini has also highlighted how this idea of flexibilization of labor is in fact intrinsic to processes of, yes, it really doesn't like me, it's very intrinsic to multinational trade law legislation. So looking at trips or looking at a variety of trade regime, Donatella actually shows that...
I'm very unhelpful. I'll keep remembering your last sentence, Donatella actually shows.
Yes, let's see what she shows. Anyway, so I think I'm cracking it. I just have to go back and do it eventually over and over again, but it's still the same thing. So she shows that the rise of WTO rules as well has been very much conducive to sort of regenerating planetary labor regimes which attributes the making of things in certain parts of the world, and then with that you have inbuilt also different forms of different regulations for labor that comes with that. Well, you can read Alessandrini thinking about the recent trade deal, right, of that Keir Starmer just signed with Modi. Of course, you have Farage that now is sort of going ballistic about, oh, yeah, this is like undercutting British workers. But actually, what the deal is doing is ensuring cheapness of Indian workers across across continents, and making sure that even as they work in the UK, these workers are not entitled to the same type of national insurance contributions that a British worker would do. So this is why Starmer signed, because it's the ultimate British job for British people, if you actually see it through the point of view of what is it that it regenerates. It regenerates areas of exception for labor laws, which of course have been very central to the evolution of the neoliberal project. Now, the third lens that I want to sort of move to is the lens of what I called raised social reproduction. I'm still quite unsure about the name, to be honest. But basically, what I think the literature I'm concerned with does is connecting social reproduction concerns with concerns over the racial nature of capitalism. Now, when I introduced the talk, I did say that one of the strengths of social reproductive frameworks is the fact that they feminize political economy questions, but they also enable us to ask new questions, okay? New questions which were not asked by political economy frameworks before. And I would say that through the lens of racial capitalism, social reproduction analysis has been able, and this has been particularly compelling in my view during COVID, has been able to address what is ultimately the key reproductive question in capitalism, which is who dies first of capitalism, okay? Now, during COVID, this question was so compelling because it was before our eyes, and it was so stark and obvious that had an element of being shocking, right? I dedicated at least 3 years to studying and writing about COVID and looking at differential rates of death across states. And it was really quite remarkable to see the reality of these differentials, how they brought the point home that who dies first really is the key reproductive question that we shall always, always remember, never forget. In the UK, the British Medical Association reports indicate that black people died at a rate that was 3.5 times faster than white counterparts. And across racialized workers, in certain sectors, of course, this was even worse. And all non-white ethnicities, with the exception of the ethnic Chinese, were actually dying way faster for reasons that they could not even pin down. Okay? Now, in the United States, we have very similar type of outcomes. If you look at the reports by the Global Lancet, But of course, then it begs the question of how there can be such differentials that are similar in a context of health system that are so remarkably entirely different. You're looking at the privatized system on the one hand in the US, and you look at the NHS on the other. So in a sense, you just have to come to terms with the fact that racism kills across a variety of health systems. So what was clear during COVID, the fact that you had, really you were witnessing what the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe have called the necropolitics of capitalism. I would say that from a broader point of view of political economy, this poses far more methodological and conceptual questions, right? So we are told by Marx that, you know, the way in which you become surplus under capitalism is by the process of labor. Okay? This is all we study in political economy when it comes to surplus population, because then, of course, this is Marxian political economy. If you study the classics or if you study the neoclassics, they have zero to say about the process of surplus life, and I have 2 degrees in economics, so in a previous life, so I can testify to that. So now, but still Marx will want to convince us, right? And many economists have learned this lesson even too well. And the worst thing that can happen to you in capitalism is not to labor, all right? So to be not part of the active reserve army is the worst thing that can happen to you, so much so that you have Robinson famously arguing the only thing in capitalism that is worse than being exploited is not to be exploited, as if it was possible at all, I would add. So, of course, this is an approach to surplus life and surplus population which is quite poor, because in the era of genocide, right, in the era of million deaths in the Mediterranean, the sea where I come from, which is a cemetery, all right, you cannot believe that the worst thing that can happen to you in capitalism is simply not to labor. Right? So I would say that if you flip the question of surplus life and surplus population from the point of view of social reproduction, as these race analyses do, starting with the work of Gargi Bhattacharya, but reaching out to fantastic work done by feminist scholars of slavery, Jennifer Morgan, Stella Dazzi, they really show that, you know, the death has always been a central aspect of political economy. The political economy of death really is where one starts from understanding surplus life, and there are a variety of possibilities between annihilation and being redundant at work. So it is within a spectrum, but of course you have a multiplication of surplus population if you look it through this lens, which instead political economy again has not addressed. From the point of view of the reproductive laws of capital, this, I guess you know where I'm going here, right? Because you do have a plethora of regulation that then establish who is in and who's out, right? And who is entitled to be part of the national capitalist project, and who is not entitled to be part of the national capitalist project. How did Keir Starmer call us lately? An island of foreigners. Every time that I hear such things, my accent thickens. Let it do its thing. So the production of illegal body, what critical migration scholars especially have highlighted as the production of illegality. De Genova, Martina Tazzioli, Novak, is central to the ways in which then the law meddles with the reproduction of surplus life and surplus population well beyond labor. Labor is but one instantiation of how this can actually happen. I think because he likes me very much that he doesn't want me to finish.
because of what you said about Keir Starmer. That's
yes, I guess. We'll have to see and explore. Now it's disappeared, so I find it difficult.
Lancet is calling for help, but last time I wasn't of much help to you.
No worries. You know what? We just disconnect this and I finished. Okay.
Sorry.
So basically, what we have seen through these three different frameworks, right, based on social reproduction, is that there's a lot that we learn from centering life as opposed to production when we study capitalism, and the different theorization of social reproduction have meant actually the possibility of studying the capitalist beast in slightly different ways. We have had insights over the architecture, the reproductive architecture of capitalism, that produce us much more information about the systemic transformations that we had since the 1970s onwards in relation to how we live as people, before only to how we labor. We first live and then we labor. Okay? Labor being a part of life, but the type of reorganization we have witnessed is far bigger. And capitalism has always been about structuring what Tronti called the social factory, transforming society in its image, right? More than simply producing things differently. So this SRT has given us. Then instead, with the early social reproduction analysis, we have learned about how value is produced and how exploitation actually takes place differently, and what are the implications, again, for political economy, and just also made some consideration about which type of rule and regulations have enabled these processes. And then with the race social reproduction analysis, we have opened up the issue of who's surplus and called out the bluff of political economy, okay? It's like only focusing on a very small aspect of what are far more systemic processes of who is liminal in the context of global capitalism, and what are the repercussions of this liminality, which we're still living through, and is reproduced over and over again. And the law, even when it tries to do something about it, look at the ICC ruling, then the issue becomes not just who makes the law, but who is able to not care about the law, right? So what are the enforcers and those instead that can sit and decide to defy it? Now, so we have subverted a huge number of political economy categories as we've gone along in this talk. When I have 5 minutes? Yeah. The first, of course, is labor, right? So that we have moved the social perimeters of the process we call labor and laboring. It doesn't have to be the industrial proletariat with this cap, and it has a very specific social makeup. It makes the history of capitalism a history of the few, which is totally uninteresting. The history of capitalism is global, and you do have different processes of laboring across the world economy, whereby exploitation, second category that we disrupt, can manifest in many different ways. So these ways might be waged in some cases, might be unwaged in the extraordinarily more brutal times. Right? So that not just women, but people from the global south, people from the colonies, colonized people, attacked people, people living under apartheid, they have not really lived the laboring relations through a wage, and they just by far outnumber the sort of industrial proletariat. And, you know, this is something which, of course, the feminist literature has been particularly good at, but you have a lot of fantastic Global South Marxist literature that actually got exactly to the same outcome, to the same conclusion. If you read the work of Jairus Banerjee on recognizing how global capitalism works through a variety of forms of exploitation since slavery and indenture, this is exactly the same type of argument. I had the pleasure of being asked to write something about the similarities between Silvia Federici's thought and Jairus Banerjee's thought. It's coming to an end. Let's see what comes out of it. Then surplus population, we also meddle with that category, right? And also we meddle, most of all, with the category of the revolutionary subject, okay? Because of course, if you expand the social perimeters on what's labor and laboring, on how values produce, or what exploitation includes, and what surplus means, or surplus life means, then ultimately what you're saying is that the revolutionary subject itself also has changed massively. And you don't find it only in the factories, but you can find it literally, and we have found it literally everywhere since the history of capitalism, okay? And the first revolts start exactly from the colonies. They don't start in the factories. So it's a way in which we give back, but it's a way where we just open up the questions of political economy and the possibilities of change dramatically. So ultimately, I think it's a way to build political economy, not to simply criticize for critics' sake. So now, to conclude, and also to discuss some of the implications from these reproductive laws of capitalism, from these three standpoints, I would say that what I said through the lens of social reproductive analysis of different types have very specific implications when we think about policy or action that of course involved legal change. And the first is how we reclaim the reproductive infrastructure of our life. So how we stop what Georges Monbiot has called the privatization of everything, okay? Which is in a sense reclaiming the commons, but at the moment the commons are just an expression that is quite flexible, okay? Because we lost so much everything that the idea to reclaiming the commons doesn't have to be seen as a sort of romantic ideas of a different path to life. We can start with our welfare budgets. That would be already a place to start. Then we can think about nationalizations. These are like projects that then come from real politics. So, you know, you don't have a normative way on what this would mean, but certainly it means shifting the focus of policy and policy making towards what many feminists are calling the caring economy. So just putting the budgets where it belongs. And I always have discussion with a lot of feminist friends on these issues because, I don't know, I was talking a few months ago in a circle, and I was just pushing for specific forms of welfare policy in relation to the privatization of early years. And the person I was talking with just came out with this, which is a great slogan, but what it means to me is a bit puzzling. Policy is the death of politics. I'm not sure what we mean. Everything we ever achieved in policy, of course we never achieve it in policy circles. We achieve it on the street. But then, of course, you need to realize that that is changes in regulation also what you want, not just what you want, but of course, policy is a highly political process, so it's not a sort of a petty issue. It's how we lost our welfare contribution, it's how it is that we have to pay £1,500 to send our kids to private nurseries because that's the only available ones we have. It's the way why you pay thousands, to be in this theater because you don't have grants anymore, because I'm old enough to remember when I moved to this country, it looked like El Dorado to us because you were given grants to study. And now instead you have to, you're lucky if you finish your student debt by age 50. So reclaiming this, you can call it policy with the small p, but instead it's something that it will require a lot of action and labor. On the realm of labor, of course, the recognition of reproductive labor as labor can mean different things, but of course it means also going back to some of the demands of the early feminist campaigns that shouted on the street wages for housework. So the recognition of self-determination incomes and the recognition of care incomes is no more small feat, and they cannot shut us out again with the idea that then they will lock women in the home, because women have been locked in the home for a very long time already. So let's try this and see what happens, because I have a hunch that once you give people a wage, then the redistribution of tasks, gender-based tasks, will happen because when activities command a wage, they're considered revalorized in a way that shifts the balance of power of who finds themselves comfortable in doing specific type of work. And also, I would say we need to call out instead the ways in which labor legislation is moving towards enabling and legitimizing soft law that is corporate law. We have seen this as the process of global informalization has mounted. We have seen this systematically from the 80s onwards, first in the rise of CSR, corporate social responsibility norms, and now with the rise of modern slavery acts of different type, that, you know, they appeal to nice language, a language that should unite us all. Slavery is a bad thing, it's a good thing that we have an act that says that. But actually, all these come from anti-trafficking, from right-wing anti-trafficking legislation, as rightly pointed out by Judy Fudge in her last book, Constructing Modern Slavery. And it's not the case that we had the Modern Slavery Act, which does not work at all, by the way, because of Theresa May. She was the engine behind it. It's never been a progressive process, and it's always been about state legitimizing the voluntarism that has built up in processes of soft law generation by corporate for many years. And finally, I would say on the surplus population, to think about reparations not as a metaphor, but what it means politically, legally, to talk about reparations, right? So if our history is a common history of racial capitalism, what it means, giving back, and this is something which is, again, very real, discussed by a number of governments in the Global South. The Jamaican government was very vocal about this and has been followed suit by a number of other governments. So, what does it mean in practice? Which type of reparative action can follow is something which I'm very interested in. And so with abolition. Abolition can become a very compelling project, but in what ways? For me, the most compelling of ways is around the issue of debt. Exactly because it structures our lives globally so incredibly at the moment. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.